Today we're going to talk about primarily constitutions, the Texas Constitution, the history of our 7 Texas constitutions. And then beyond that, we'll talk about federalism in Texas within a federal system. Okay, so we're going to begin and talk about constitutions and what a good constitution is. Constitution is not so much a set of rules to govern society, right? That would be more like a code of laws. A constitution is how we're going to create those laws or rules for how the government of society will run. So a code of laws, you could think of Hammurabi's Code, 1700 BC, ancient Mesopotamia, was a code laid out by the king at the time that delegated rules for all of society. So punishments, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, this is exactly where that saying comes from. All the punishments for stealing, all the prices of everything, how much you would pay in taxes if you bought a donkey from someone. All of those things were laid out in Hammurabi's Code in exact and explicit detail. It's very different than what we have in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution doesn't lay down any laws or punishments, and instead it lays down the form of how our government will function. Likewise, for Texas government, we have a constitution that talks about the ways our constitution will be amended, the ways our representatives will be elected, how long they will serve for, the way in which the governor is elected, and how long his terms serve for. This is what we really want to see in a constitution. For a lot of years, it was really believed by scholars that the United States Constitution was the model in the world. This was because our Constitution is the longest standing. It took political scientists some time in order to compile a lot of the data on different constitutions, to translate them and to begin to look at them scientifically. And what I mean by this is breaking down all of these different parts of a constitution, right? And breaking them down into numbers. So you can give a value for a 1 or a 0, for example, whether or not a constitution grants you a parliamentary or a presidential system. A 1 or a 0 if your chief executive has term limits, for example. Then you get this, let's say we have 30 or 50 different variables, each of which is a 1 or a 0. For each constitution there along the column, we know how long that constitution has stood for. And we go through, and for all constitutions, we start by presidentialism or parliamentarism. And for those constitutions that have a 1 or a 0, we hold all other variables constant and see how long does just changing this one variable make a difference in the length that that constitution will stand. You then go through and examine every single variable one by one, and the computer module will tell you how different that makes the expected length of regime, how much of an effect on it has. Through this method, political scientists go through and begin to deconstruct what's important in a constitution. By creating variables and giving them numeric assignments, this is the same way that they can tell you how much more likely a woman is to vote than a man, or a black person to vote for a white person, for example. It's by holding all of these other things the same, right? Income in this example. If we're going to look at gender, you would hold income, race, religion, geography. You want to look at all of these things with the exact same, and among those, the only difference in gender. And that difference in voting turnout would give you the effect of gender. Similarly, we would be looking at what instances or what variables in constitutions are most significant to lead constitutions to be in place for longer amounts of time. It turns out that the United States Constitution is not the best model. It's very long and it's very abstract. Good constitutions are very detailed. The United States Constitution is short and abstract. Good constitutions tend to be long, they tend to be clear, and they tend to be very detailed. They cut down on the possibility for there to be conflicts of power or disagreements over the wording of the Constitution. More ideal constitutions would probably look like Mexico or India, not Italy, India. More ideal constitutions look like those than ours. One explanation, and we'll return to this when we talk about our Constitution in Texas, is the political culture that we have in this country, right? We hold a high reverence for our Constitution. If you ever, if it's in Philadelphia, right, you go and see the document, and it's encased in glass, and it's protected, and it's almost like a tomb, very similar to how the Russians would keep linen, right, encased in glass, almost like the state religion, if you will. So our political culture and respect for our Constitution is paramount, right? Again, what a Constitution is a set of guidelines for how the rules will be written, right, or a set of guidelines for how the government will run, instead of how the society functions in general. So Texas, as a state, has gone through 7 constitutions that govern, at least to some degree, what we recognize as our state borders, right? These constitutions are Texas constitutions and not national. The first of which was ratified in 1827, and that wasn't the state of Texas or the Republic of Texas, but at that time the state of Coahuila y Tejas within Mexico. The second constitution was ratified March 2nd of 1836. After Texas gained its independence in 1835, this Constitution in 1836 declared Texas an independent nation. In 1845, exactly 10 years after winning their independence from Mexico, Texas President Anson Jones calls a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. The purpose of this in 1845 is to allow Texas to join the Union. The fourth Constitution was written in 1861, and that is to allow Texas to secede from the Union. Very few changes between the Constitutions of 1845 and 1861. The major difference just being the necessary language added to remove Texas from the Union with the South during the Civil War. One of the things historically that's very important to note here is in this Constitution of 1861, Texas has a declaration of causes for their secession. In their declaration of causes, first and foremost, those legislators and authors of the document put that Texas was seceding in defense of slavery. This 1861, right, less than not even 30 years removed from Texas independence when this is published, and it's already in defense of slavery. This directly backs up the claim in the assertion that the movement for Texas independence was also largely in defense of slavery, because remember, at that time, Mexico had outlawed slavery. So by 1861, the state of Texas is still claiming this is a large reason for their necessity to write a new constitution and withdraw from the North. By 1866, Texas has been on the losing side of the Civil War, and Texas attempts to draft a new constitution. This constitution is a temporary constitution, and it's a constitution that knows that the Texas Democrats at that time are trying to write a constitution before the federal government comes and occupies them. And they understand that the constitution that is written when the federal government comes is going to be much to their dislike. And so this is the attempt of Texans to write a constitution that will satisfy the federal government, but may not be as harsh as they feared. In 1869, that fear comes to life as a new federally written constitution is laid down. This is a constitution of Reconstruction, right? It guarantees full equality for all citizens, compulsory schooling for all citizens, and centralizes the government much more so. Reconstruction was a period of time after the Civil War in which the South was occupied by the military in order to help rebuild its economy and also integrate African Americans into society at that time. During Reconstruction, we had gains in democracy like we have never seen. We had more elected black representatives to House and Congress than we do today during that period of time. The entire lower House of South Carolina was majority black. So we had a lot of different changes and moments of representation in popular democracy in this country that we really have not seen since then during Reconstruction. It ended when Rutherford B. Hayes lost the presidency, but agreed to end Reconstruction in exchange for the White House. So Rutherford B. Hayes loses the presidential vote, agrees to occupy the White House in return for ending Reconstruction. In history, this is what's known as the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, and ends Reconstruction. But the constitutions of 1861 and much more, 1866 and much more so 1869 were constitutions both written during Reconstruction. After Construction ends, the Democrats regain control and write a new constitution in 1876, which is the current constitution that we see today. It was dominated by farming interests. It reduced the governor's terms to 2 years, all executive office terms to 2 years. It decided that the legislature would meet only for 140 days every 2 years. Prohibited a property tax and only allowed income tax if approved by voters. Our Constitution, when written in 1876, more than almost anything else, was distrustful of big government. The Constitution was written and intended to limit the ability of government to govern and limit the ability of government to interfere in individuals' lives. The Texas Constitution, just like the United States Constitution, lays out an amendment process. Amendments can be proposed in the House or in the Senate, and they can be proposed in a regular session or a special session. We'll talk about that more later on. But they begin in Congress. After that, they have to be approved by Congress with a 2/3 vote. After some period in which this amendment is published and debated in newspapers, the amendments finally have to be approved by a majority of state voters. Therefore, that same process is what is needed to draft a new constitution. It would have to go through the state's voters. Our Texas Constitution has over 200 amendments. It's one of, over 480 amendments. It's one of the longest and most amended constitutions in the United States. It's one of the most complex and least efficient. We've tried to amend it numerous times, but perhaps because of our political culture in this country, in this state, the voters always turn it down. We will look at this more later on in the semester when we talk about the legislature. So lastly, we're going to lay out some of the major themes that are found within the Texas and United States Constitution. The first two of these are separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers is defined as the division of governmental powers among separate institutions that must cooperate in decision making. So through this, we can think of the three different branches of United States government. We can think about the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The legislature is going to be the lawmaking body. That's going to be in our federal government. That's going to be our national Congress. In the state, that's going to be our Congress. At the Texas level, locally in for Harris County or for Houston, that would just be our city council. The executive enforces the laws, right? The executive office is the office of the president, the governor, the mayor. Lastly, the judiciary is the court system. They're traditionally charged with interpreting the law. Power is split between these three. In order for a bill to become a law in Texas, it requires both action by the Congress and some action by the governor, or some decision to be made by the governor, at least. No law can be made, or there should be limits on laws that can be made by the executive, and this is the same in our executive, or in our federal system, right? There are limits on laws or what can be done by any one branch of government. Secondly, this idea of checks and balances, right, is the constitutional idea that overlapping power is given to different branches of the government. So a bill can be passed, let's say, with the Congress and the president, um, but that bill might be interpreted as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Right? Or the Congress might get a bill through the legislature, and the president or the governor might decide to veto or bring action against that bill to stop it from passing. Right? These are different ideas that are enshrined not only in our federal government, but also within our local state government. The last principle of government we need to discuss is federalism. Federalism applies to Texas just like it does to all other 50 states, as the fundamental principle of our United States government. Federalism is the idea of blended sovereignty between the national and localized units. In this case, the national unit is the federal government, and the principal localized units that we're talking about are the states, although there is some federalism at work in the autonomy of cities within states. The idea of federalism was first proposed by the Iroquois League. Federalism is written about extensively in Thomas Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia, but it was not a European conception. Iroquois League consisted of 5 different American Indian tribes who regulated their own internal affairs and who joined together for cases of war and other matters that affected all tribes. In this delegation, they voted and acted as one union coming out of that Iroquois League. However, in all other matters, they were separate. This was a stronger accord than a confederation, which the United States had used previously, but new at the time. If you look at European systems of government, they're the same. If you go to Spain or you go to England, you don't have different speed limits across the country. You don't see marijuana legal in some parts of the country and not others. You have one uniform set of laws. It's due to our system of federalism that you see this diversity. What federalism allows for, and specifically through the 10th Amendment, grants powers to states that is not otherwise specified by the Constitution. So the 10th Amendment grants these powers to the states, and they're unspecified, right? In the Constitution, the federal Constitution itself, there's also the National Supremacy Clause that first and foremost says that federal law is the supreme law of the land. Therefore, when you think about minimum wage, if minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, is set at $10, then that is the minimum that it could be anywhere in the United States. If it gets raised to 15, that would be the minimum it could be anywhere in the United States. Now, other states, let's say California, could raise their minimum wage above that threshold. They could raise it to 18, and that would be legal. But the absolute minimum, because of federal law, is 15. Likewise, there are certain federal laws for a host of things, and those are the same in all states. However, there are some things that are left up to the states to determine at their own, right? You can think about the death penalty and the use of that being one of those, right? The federal government does not outlaw or force any state to use the death penalty in cases of capital punishment. That's a decision of the states. One of the things that this allows for is political culture to express itself in each state, right? We expect that the laws in Texas will look different than the laws in Washington. Part of that is because of our political culture. We believe in individual rights, limited government, right? You can clearly see that in the number of people that we have that are uninsured in this state, which is higher than any other, and our feelings about open carry, and our low minimum wage, right? All of these things are unique expressions of Texas political culture, but also through the system of federalism, we are allowed to express those on our own, right? Same reason why when you drive into Louisiana, the speed limit drops 5 miles an hour, right? That's their decision. Likewise, right, there are some decisions that will be left locally to the city of Houston. You can think about smoking or drinking in some cases, right? That's dependent not on the state, but on the city, right? Whether or not you're allowed to smoke inside, for example, or drink outside, that can be a citywide ordinance and is not necessarily dependent on the state. So this system of federalism then is a division of power between a centralized and a state government. It's one that is crucial to understanding United States government. We'll talk about it further as the course goes on, especially as we get into voting and voting districts. This will wrap up the lecture for today. As always, please email me with any comments.
Juan Cosío. ¡Guarda! ¡Guarda! Le valió madre.